The blood on Eliza Monroe's hands had long since dried, but she still scrubbed them raw every morning before dawn, as if soap and cold water could wash away the memory of her father dying in her arms on that dusty Kansas road 3 months ago. She had arrived in Redemption, Colorado in late April of 1876, with nothing but the clothes on her back, a small leather satchel containing her mother's wedding ring, and a hollow ache in her chest that made breathing feel like a chore. The town sat nestled in a valley surrounded by the Rocky Mountains, a place where miners and ranchers lived side by side in an uneasy truce brokered by whiskey and mutual necessity. Eliza had taken the only job available to a woman alone, working as a server at the Trail's End boarding house, where dusty cowboys and weathered prospectors paid 50 cents for a hot meal and a clean bed. The work was honest if exhausting. Mrs. Cordelia Hutchins, the boarding house proprietor, was a stern woman with iron-gray hair and a heart that occasionally showed glimpses of softness beneath her practical exterior. She had given Eliza a small room in the attic, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, but it was hers, and that meant everything. The first rule Mrs. Hutchins had laid down was simple. The help ate after the guests were served and satisfied. Eliza had nodded, understanding immediately that her place was to ensure others were cared for before attending to her own needs. It was not so different from the life she had known before. Her mother had died when Eliza was 12, leaving her to care for her father and 3 younger brothers on their struggling farm outside Abilene. She had learned early that her hunger mattered less than theirs, that her comfort was secondary to their survival. By the time her brothers had grown and scattered to seek their fortunes, the pattern was set deep in her bones. Even after her father's death, after the bandits had taken everything and left her with nothing but grief, she could not shake the instinct to wait, to hold back, to make herself smaller so others could have more. The boarding house served breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, and supper at 7. Eliza would rise before dawn to help Mrs. Hutchins and the cook, a cheerful Chinese man named Chen who had come west with the railroad, and stayed when he discovered he preferred feeding people to laying track. Together they would prepare vast quantities of flapjacks, bacon, beans, beef stew, cornbread, and whatever else could be stretched to feed 20 hungry men. The smells would make Eliza's stomach clench with hunger, but she trained herself not to notice, moving through the dining room with practiced efficiency, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates while the men ate and talked and laughed. She never took a bite until every guest had finished and left the dining room. Only then would she sit at the small table in the kitchen, eating whatever remained, often cold and congealed. Mrs. Hutchins had noticed early on and commented that Eliza was welcome to eat with the staff before service, but Eliza had politely declined. She could not explain the compulsion, the deep-seated belief that she had not earned her food until everyone else's needs were met. It was simply the way things were. James Hollister had been coming to the Trail's End for meals 3 times a week since he had hired on as foreman at the Double R Ranch the previous winter. He was a man of few words, 26 years old, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of whiskey held up to lamplight. He had grown up in Texas, learned to rope and ride before he could properly read, and had drifted north after the war between the states had taken his father and older brother. Colorado suited him. The mountains felt like shelter, and the work was honest. He had a small cabin on the ranch property and saved most of his wages, dreaming vaguely of buying his own spread someday, though he had not yet found a reason compelling enough to make the dream feel real. He noticed Eliza Monroe on her 3rd day working at the boarding house. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in a quiet way that snuck up on a man. She had dark honey-colored hair that she kept pinned tightly at the nape of her neck, and gray eyes that seemed to hold storms she refused to let loose. She was slender, almost too thin, and she moved through the dining room like a ghost, silent and efficient. What caught James's attention was the way she flinched when one of the miners, drunk on his own voice, had shouted for more coffee. It was a tiny movement, quickly controlled, but James had seen enough fear in his life to recognize it instantly. After that, he watched her. Not in a way that would make her uncomfortable, he hoped, but with the quiet attention of a man who noticed when things were not quite right. He saw that she never smiled, not really, though she maintained a polite expression that served as a placeholder. He saw that she carried herself as though trying to take up as little space as possible, shoulders slightly hunched, movements economical and contained. He saw that she wore the same 2 dresses in rotation, both faded and carefully mended, and that her shoes were worn nearly through at the soles. But what he noticed most, over the weeks that followed, was that Eliza never ate during service. She would stand by the kitchen door between courses, her hands folded, her expression distant, while the men at the tables devoured everything Chen cooked. Even when service was winding down and only a few stragglers remained, picking at their plates and nursing their coffee, she would not take a bite. James began to linger, ordering extra coffee he did not want, pretending to read the week-old newspaper Mrs. Hutchins kept on a side table. He watched Eliza clear the last plates, wipe down the last tables, and only then disappear into the kitchen. One evening in early June, curiosity got the better of him. He waited until Eliza had cleared his table and retreated to the kitchen, then quietly rose and positioned himself where he could see through the partially open door. What he saw made his chest tighten. Eliza sat alone at a small wooden table, her shoulders curved with exhaustion, eating what looked like cold beans and a heel of bread. She ate quickly, mechanically, without pleasure or attention, as though fueling herself was a task to be completed rather than a comfort to be enjoyed. The portions were small, far too small for someone who had been on her feet working for hours. James returned to his seat, his mind working. Over the next week, he paid closer attention. It was the same at every meal. Eliza served everyone, refilled everything, cleaned everything, and only then did she eat, always alone, always whatever scraps remained. The other diners did not seem to notice or care. To them, she was simply part of the furniture, as unremarkable as the checkered tablecloths or the oil lamps hanging from the ceiling. But James cared, though he could not have articulated exactly why. There was something about her quiet self-denial that troubled him deeply, something that spoke of wounds he could not see but sensed nonetheless. He began to think about how he might change the pattern without embarrassing her or drawing unwanted attention. Direct confrontation would not work. He knew instinctively that Eliza would retreat further into herself if challenged. He needed to be subtle, to find a way to care for her that did not feel like charity or pity. The idea came to him one morning as he watched her serve breakfast. The boarding house operated on a system where the food was brought out in large serving dishes and placed on the tables for the men to help themselves. It was efficient but chaotic, with the hungry and aggressive taking more than their share while the polite went without. James realized that if the system changed, even slightly, he could create an opportunity. The next evening, he arrived for supper early, before the main rush. Mrs. Hutchins greeted him with a nod, and he took his usual seat near the window. Eliza appeared moments later, carrying a pot of coffee. "Evening, Miss Monroe," James said, tipping his hat though he was indoors. He had never addressed her directly before, and he saw surprise flicker across her face. "Good evening, Mr. Hollister," she replied, her voice soft and careful. "Coffee, please." He watched as she poured, her hands steady despite the weight of the pot. "I was wondering if I might ask you something." She looked at him then, fully, and he saw wariness in her gray eyes. "Of course." "I've been thinking that the way we serve meals here could be improved," he said, keeping his tone casual and thoughtful. "All that reaching and grabbing, it is not very civilized. I wonder if it might be better if the staff plated the meals in the kitchen and brought them out." "Seems like it would be more orderly." Eliza blinked, clearly not having expected this topic. "I suppose that would be Mrs. Hutchins's decision, sir." Would you mind suggesting it to her? Tell her it was my idea if it helps. I would do it myself, but I think she might take it better coming from you. I can mention it, Eliza said slowly, though her expression suggested she thought the entire conversation was strange. James smiled at her, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I would appreciate that. Thank you, Miss Monroe. She nodded and moved on to fill other cups, and James sat back, hoping his gamble would pay off. Mrs. Hutchins was a practical woman, and the suggestion made sense from an efficiency standpoint. If the staff plated the meals, there would be less waste, better portion control, and a more refined atmosphere. It would also mean that Eliza would handle the food directly, and James could ensure she received a proper portion before it ever reached the dining room. To his satisfaction, the change was implemented within 3 days. Mrs. Hutchins announced at breakfast that they would be trying a new service style, and the men grumbled but accepted it. Chen seemed pleased, saying it would help him better judge how much food to prepare. And Eliza, though she said nothing, adapted smoothly to the new routine. The first evening under the new system, James arrived and took his seat. Eliza brought his plate, and he saw immediately that it was generously portioned. He thanked her and began to eat, watching as she served the other men. Everything seemed to be going according to the regular routine until service was nearly finished. Then James saw Eliza carry 2 plates back into the kitchen. He knew without asking that one was for Chen and one for herself. The next evening, James arrived even earlier. He found Chen in the kitchen pulling a roast from the oven. "That smells incredible," James said, leaning against the doorframe. Chen grinned. "Beef roast with potatoes and carrots, very good." "I was thinking," James said carefully, "that Miss Monroe works very hard. She is always the last to eat. It seems to me that she should get her plate first so she can have the best portions while the food is hot." Chen looked at him, his dark eyes sharp with understanding. "You like her?" James felt heat climb his neck. "I think she deserves to be taken care of, same as anyone." "She will not take it if I offer directly," Chen said. "She always says to feed everyone else first. Then do not offer. Just make her a plate and set it aside before service begins. Tell her it is the new policy. First server gets the first plate, make it seem like a rule, not a kindness." Chen studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You are a good man, James Hollister. Yes, I will do this." The following evening, James positioned himself where he could see into the kitchen through the serving window. He watched Chen prepare a plate before service began, piling it high with the best cuts of meat, the crispiest potatoes, the freshest vegetables. When Eliza came into the kitchen to begin carrying out the meals for the guests, Chen stopped her. "New rule from Mrs. Hutchins," Chen said, his tone matter-of-fact. "First server eats first, your plate is ready, sit and eat before you serve." Eliza stared at the plate, confusion and something like panic crossing her face. "But the guests will wait 5 minutes, Chen said firmly. "Food is not even all ready yet. Sit, eat. This is how we do it now." James watched Eliza's internal struggle play out across her expressive face. She looked at the plate, at Chen, at the dining room beyond. Finally, with visible reluctance, she sat. She picked up her fork and took a small bite. And even from his position across the room, James could see the surprise that flickered through her when she tasted the hot, well-seasoned food. She ate quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the new arrangement, but she ate. And when she carried the first plates out to the dining room, there was a faint flush of color in her cheeks that had not been there before. James caught Chen's eye through the window and nodded his thanks. The cook smiled and returned to his work. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Eliza resisted at first, trying to argue that she did not need to eat before service, that it was not right, that the guests should come first. But Chen was immovable, and Mrs. Hutchins, when consulted, agreed that it made sense for the staff to be fed before they began the demanding work of serving. Gradually, with the reluctance of a wild creature learning to trust, Eliza began to accept the new routine. James watched the changes in her with quiet satisfaction. She began to look less gaunt, her face filling out slightly, her movements gaining strength. The shadows under her eyes lightened. She still did not smile often, but occasionally he would catch a glimpse of something softer in her expression when Chen made a joke or when a guest thanked her with genuine politeness. He began to find small reasons to interact with her. He would ask about the weather, comment on how busy the boarding house was, inquire if she had heard any news from the town. She responded politely but sparingly, keeping a careful distance. James did not push. He understood that trust was earned slowly and he was a patient man. One evening in late July, a commotion broke out in the dining room. One of the miners, a belligerent man named Cutter who drank too much and had a reputation for meanness, had grabbed Eliza's wrist as she passed his table. "About time I got some attention from a pretty thing like you," he slurred, yanking her closer. James was on his feet before he consciously decided to move. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and clamped his hand down on Cutter's shoulder, his fingers digging in hard enough to make the man yelp. "Let her go," James said, his voice low and dangerous. Cutter looked up, his eyes bleary and defiant. "I was just having a bit of fun. Let her go." Something in James's tone must have penetrated Cutter's whiskey-soaked brain because he released Eliza's wrist. She stumbled back, her face pale, cradling her arm against her chest. James did not release Cutter's shoulder. "If you ever touch her again, you will answer to me. Understood?" Cutter muttered something that might have been agreement, and James let him go with a little shove. He turned to Eliza, his expression softening. "Are you all right, Miss Monroe?" She nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Yes, thank you. Let me see your wrist. It is fine. Let me see it." Reluctantly, she held out her arm. There were already red marks forming where Cutter's fingers had gripped too tight. James felt anger surge through him again, but he kept his voice gentle. "You should put something cold on that. Chen will have a cloth you can wet." "I have work to finish," Eliza said, trying to pull her hand back. James held on carefully, his touch light enough that she could break away if she wanted. "The work can wait 5 minutes, please." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw confusion in her eyes, as though she could not quite understand why he would concern himself with her well-being. After a moment, she nodded. James escorted her to the kitchen, ignoring the stares of the other diners. Chen took one look at Eliza's wrist and immediately began preparing a cold compress, muttering angrily in Cantonese about men who did not know how to behave. Mrs. Hutchins appeared, having heard the commotion, and she looked ready to throw Cutter out on his ear. "He paid for the week," she said grimly, "but he will not be welcome here again after that. I will not have my girls mistreated." Eliza sat at the small kitchen table while Chen pressed the cold cloth to her wrist. James stood nearby, his arms crossed, feeling protective and furious in equal measure. He watched the way Eliza held herself together, not crying, not complaining, just enduring as she seemed to endure everything. "You did not have to intervene," Eliza said quietly, speaking to James without looking at him. "Yes, I did," James replied. "I can handle difficult guests." "I am sure you can, but you should not have to." She was silent for a moment, then raised her eyes to his. "Why do you care?" It was a blunt question, and it deserved an honest answer. James crouched down so he was at her eye level. "Because you deserve to be cared about." "Because every time I see you give and give and give without taking anything for yourself, it troubles me. Because I think you have been hurt, and I think you believe you do not matter as much as everyone else, and I think you are wrong." Eliza's eyes widened, and for a moment James thought he had overstepped, pushed too far, said too much. Then her face crumpled, just slightly, just enough that he could see the cracks in her carefully maintained composure. "I do not know how to be any other way," she whispered. "Maybe you could learn," James said gently, "if someone was willing to teach you." She stared at him, and he stared back, and something shifted between them, something fragile and tentative but real. Chen cleared his throat. "The compress needs to stay on for a while. You sit." "I will finish the service." "I can help," Mrs. Hutchins said briskly, clearly reading the room and deciding to give them space. Come along, Chen." The two of them disappeared into the dining room, leaving James and Eliza alone in the warm kitchen. The sounds of the boarding house continued around them, men talking, dishes clattering, the creak of floorboards overhead, but the kitchen felt like its own separate world. "Tell me about your family," James said after a moment, pulling a chair over and sitting down across from her. Eliza hesitated, then began to speak. She told him about her mother's death, about raising her brothers, about her father's struggle to keep the farm going. She told him about the trip they had been making to visit her aunt in Colorado, about the bandits who had stopped their wagon on a lonely road, about holding her father as he bled out from a gunshot wound while she begged him not to leave her. James listened without interrupting, his heart aching for her. When she finished, her voice hoarse from the telling, he reached across the table and took her hand, the one that was not injured. "I am sorry," he said. "You have lost too much." "Everyone loses people," Eliza said, but her fingers curled around his, holding on. "That does not make your loss matter less." They sat like that for a long time, hands linked across the scarred wooden table, while the dinner service continued without them. James knew that he was crossing a line, that he was allowing himself to feel things he had kept carefully contained for years. But looking at Eliza, at the vulnerability and strength warring in her face, he found he did not care. When Chen and Mrs. Hutchins returned, they found James and Eliza talking quietly, her hand still in his. Mrs. Hutchins raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She had seen the way James looked at Eliza, and she was a romantic underneath her practical exterior. Over the weeks that followed, James became a fixture at the boarding house beyond mealtimes. He would stop by in the evenings after his work at the ranch was done, ostensibly to have coffee and read the newspaper, but really to see Eliza. He began to walk her home on her one afternoon off per week, a respectful 2 feet of distance between them as they strolled through the dusty streets of Redemption. He learned that she loved to read but had no books, so he began bringing her volumes from the small collection at the ranch house, dog-eared dime novels and leather-bound classics alike. Eliza, for her part, began to soften. She started to smile more, small expressions that lit up her entire face. She began to talk more freely, sharing her thoughts and opinions instead of just polite nothingness. She still struggled with accepting kindness, still tried to serve herself last and take the smallest portions, but James and Chen had formed an alliance to counteract her instincts. James would request that she sit with him while he ate, just for the company, and she would reluctantly agree. Chen would make too much food and insist that it would go to waste if she did not take it. The town noticed, of course. Small towns always did. Tongues wagged about the foreman from the Double R Ranch and the quiet girl at the boarding house. Some of the gossip was kind, some less so. Eliza heard the whispers and flinched from them, but James met them head-on. "Let them talk," he said one evening as they walked beside the creek that ran through town, the water glinting gold in the setting sun. "They have nothing better to do." "They say I am trying to trap you," Eliza said quietly, "that I am using my position to catch a husband." James stopped walking and turned to face her. "Do you care what they think? I do not want to cause trouble for you. Eliza, look at me." He waited until her gray eyes met his. "I am courting you because I want to, because when I am near you the world makes more sense. Because your strength amazes me, and your kindness humbles me, and I want to spend every moment I can in your presence. What anyone else thinks about that does not matter even a little bit." She blinked rapidly, and he realized with alarm that she was crying. "No one has ever said anything like that to me before." "Then the men you have known were fools," James said firmly. He reached up and brushed away her tears with his thumb, his touch gentle. "You are extraordinary, Eliza Monroe. I wish you could see yourself the way I see you." "I am trying," she whispered. "When I am with you, it is easier to believe that I might matter. You do matter, you matter to me." He kissed her then, soft and careful, asking rather than demanding. Eliza froze for a heartbeat, then melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt as though she needed to hold on to something solid. The kiss was sweet and tentative and full of all the things neither of them quite knew how to say. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Eliza's cheeks were flushed, her lips slightly parted, and James thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. "I am falling in love with you," he said, the words escaping before he could think better of them. Eliza's eyes went wide. "James, you do not have to say it back. I just needed you to know. I am falling in love with you too," she said in a rush. "I have been for weeks, but I was afraid, I am still afraid. What if I am not enough? What if you realize that I am just a broken thing with too much damage?" James pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on top of her head. "You are not broken. You are healing. There is a difference." They stood like that as the sun dipped below the mountains and the stars began to appear, two people who had both known loss and loneliness, finding something like home in each other. The courtship continued through the summer and into the fall. James was patient and steady, never pushing Eliza further than she was ready to go, always waiting for her to come to him. He learned the ways she showed love through acts of service, through quiet attention, through the way she saved him the best biscuit or remembered how he liked his coffee. He tried to teach her that she could receive as well as give with mixed success. Old habits died hard. One evening in September, James took Eliza to a dance at the town hall. She had been reluctant to go, insisting she did not know how to dance and would embarrass him, but he had coaxed her into it. She wore a new dress, a simple blue calico that Mrs. Hutchins had helped her make, and James thought she was the prettiest woman in the room. He kept her close as they danced, not because he was possessive but because he could feel her nervousness and wanted her to know she was safe. Other couples swirled around them, the fiddle music bright and lively, but James only had eyes for Eliza. "You are doing fine," he murmured into her ear as they moved through a simple waltz. "I stepped on your foot twice already," she replied, embarrassed. "I did not notice." She laughed then, a real laugh, and the sound went straight to James's heart. He spun her around, making her laugh again, and when the song ended, he led her outside for some fresh air. The night was cool and clear, the stars brilliant against the black sky. They stood on the porch of the town hall, watching the mountains rise like dark guardians around the valley. "I have been thinking," James said after a moment of comfortable silence. "About what?" "About the future. About buying that piece of land I have been saving for, about building a house." Eliza turned to look at him, her expression careful. "That sounds wonderful." "I have been thinking that I would like to build a house with a big kitchen, with lots of windows so the light comes in, and a porch so you could sit and read in the evenings. And a bedroom for us and maybe someday rooms for children." Eliza's breath caught. "James, what are you saying?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple gold band set with a single small sapphire, the color of a summer sky. "I am saying that I love you, Eliza Monroe. I am saying that I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to wait to be fed, never have to make yourself small, never have to put yourself last. I am saying that I want to build a life with you if you will have me. Will you marry me?" Eliza stared at the ring, then at James, then back at the ring. Tears streamed down her face, and for a terrifying moment, James thought she was going to say no. "Yes," she whispered finally. "Yes, I will marry you." Relief and joy flooded through James in equal measure. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands shaking slightly, and then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with all the love and promise he could pour into the gesture. When they returned to the dance, Eliza's hand clasped firmly in his, the ring glinting in the lamplight. There was a moment of surprised silence before cheers and congratulations erupted. Mrs. Hutchins cried and hugged Eliza so hard she squeaked. Chen grinned and pumped James's hand enthusiastically. Even some of the men who had been coldest toward Eliza seemed genuinely pleased, caught up in the romance of it all. They were married in October, just as the aspens turned gold and the air took on the crisp bite of coming winter. The ceremony was held in the small church at the edge of town, with Mrs. Hutchins and Chen standing as witnesses. Eliza wore a cream-colored dress with lace at the collar, and James wore his best suit, his hair slicked back and his boots polished to a shine. Reverend Pierce kept the ceremony short and sweet, and when he pronounced them man and wife, James kissed his bride with such tender reverence that several of the women in attendance sniffled into their handkerchiefs. The celebration afterward was held at the boarding house, with Chen preparing a feast that would be talked about for years. There was roast beef and ham, potatoes cooked 3 different ways, fresh bread, pies, and a cake that Mrs. Hutchins had special ordered from Denver. The dining room was packed with well-wishers, and for once, Eliza did not try to serve. She sat at the head table beside her husband, her hand in his, and let herself be celebrated. James watched her throughout the meal, noting the way she still sometimes hesitated before taking food, the way she glanced around as if checking that everyone else had been served. But when he squeezed her hand and leaned in to whisper, "Eat, sweetheart. This meal is for you," she smiled and obeyed. They spent their wedding night in the cabin on the Double R Ranch, which James had cleaned and decorated as best he could. There were wildflowers in a jar on the table, and he had hung curtains that Mrs. Hutchins had sewn as a wedding gift. The bed was small but comfortable, and James was patient and gentle as he taught his wife the language of physical love. Eliza was nervous at first, but she trusted James, and trust made all the difference. He worshipped her with his touch, whispering how beautiful she was, how much he loved her, how lucky he was to call her his wife. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Eliza's head resting on James's chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Are you happy?" James asked softly. "So happy I am afraid I will wake up and find it was all a dream," Eliza replied. "Not a dream, real. You are stuck with me now, Mrs. Hollister." She smiled against his skin. "I think I can live with that." They settled into married life with surprising ease. Eliza continued to work at the boarding house for several more months, wanting to help save money for their future homestead. James worked long hours at the ranch, often coming home exhausted but always brightening when he saw his wife. They lived simply but contentedly, making plans and dreaming together. In the spring of 1877, James purchased a piece of land about 5 miles outside of Redemption. It was 200 acres of grassland backed up against the foothills, with a creek running through it and a stand of pine trees that provided shelter from the wind. He spent every spare moment working on the house, often with help from the other ranch hands who had grown fond of him. It was a modest structure, just 3 rooms to start, but it was solidly built and filled with light, just as James had promised. They moved in during May, and Eliza cried when she saw the kitchen James had built for her. It was larger than she had expected, with a big cast-iron stove, open shelves for dishes, and a table that could seat 6. There were windows on 2 walls, and the view looked out over the grassland toward the mountains. "It is perfect," she said, turning in a circle to take it all in. "You are perfect," James replied, pulling her into his arms. They spent the summer establishing their homestead. James bought 6 head of cattle and a small flock of chickens. Eliza planted a garden, coaxing vegetables from the soil with the same patience James had used to coax her heart open. They worked side by side, sunup to sundown, and fell into bed each night exhausted and content. But the thing James was most proud of was the way Eliza was healing. Slowly, incrementally, she was learning to put herself first sometimes. She no longer waited to eat until James had finished. Instead, they sat down together and shared their meals. She no longer insisted on doing all the work herself. She learned to ask for help when she needed it. She was learning day by day that her needs and wants mattered, that she deserved care and attention and love. There were still hard days. Sometimes Eliza would slip back into old patterns, trying to make herself invisible, insisting she did not need things that she clearly did. But James was always there, gentle and firm, reminding her that she was his wife, his partner, his equal, reminding her that she was loved. One evening in late August, Eliza realized that her monthly courses were late. She waited another week, afraid to hope, before she told James. His reaction was everything she could have wanted. He whooped with joy, picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down and fussed over whether he had been too rough. "I am not made of glass," Eliza said, laughing at his expression. "You are carrying our child. I will treat you like precious cargo from now on." "Please do not," Eliza said, but she was smiling, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. The pregnancy was not easy. Eliza was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep food down. James worried constantly, trying to tempt her with different dishes, making sure she had water and crackers by the bedside. When the sickness finally passed, it was replaced by exhaustion that pinned her to the bed for hours at a time. James took on more of the household chores without complaint, cooking and cleaning and tending the animals while Eliza rested. "I should be doing more," Eliza said one afternoon, watching guiltily as James scrubbed the kitchen floor. "You are growing a human," James replied. "That is enough." "But I feel useless." James stopped scrubbing and came to sit beside her on the bed. He took her hand and placed it over his heart. "You are the most important thing in my world, you and this baby. If all you do is rest and stay healthy, that is everything. Do you understand?" Eliza nodded, tears in her eyes. Even after nearly 2 years with James, she still struggled sometimes to accept that she was worth caring for. But she was trying, and that was what mattered. Their son was born in April of 1878 during a late spring snowstorm that made travel impossible. James delivered the baby himself, with guidance shouted through the door by their neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who could not get inside due to the snow drifts. It was terrifying and miraculous in equal measure. When James heard his son's first cry, he felt something in his chest crack open, a love so fierce it was almost painful. They named him William, after James's father, and called him Will. He was a healthy baby with his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair. Eliza took to motherhood with the same fierce dedication she brought to everything, but James was vigilant, making sure she did not neglect herself in her care for their son. He would take Will for hours at a time, walking with him, talking to him, letting Eliza rest or read or simply be still. "You do not have to do all of this," Eliza said one evening, watching as James changed Will's diaper with practiced efficiency. "I want to," James said simply. "He is my son too, and I like taking care of him, taking care of you both." Eliza felt her heart swell with love for this man who had saved her in so many ways, who continued to save her every day by insisting she was worth saving. The years rolled on, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. In 1880, their daughter Sarah was born, a lively baby with her father's easy smile. In 1882, another son, Thomas, arrived, completing their family. The homestead grew and prospered. James bought more land and more cattle. Eliza's garden expanded to include fruit trees and berry bushes. They added rooms to the house, built a proper barn, and became pillars of the small community that was forming in the valley. Through it all, James never forgot the way he had first noticed Eliza, hungry and selfless, giving everything and taking nothing. He made it his life's mission to ensure she never felt that way again. Every meal they shared, he served her first, filling her plate with care and attention. It became a ritual between them, a silent reaffirmation of his love and her worth. "You are still doing it," Eliza said one evening in 1885, watching as James filled her plate before his own at supper. "Doing what?" James asked innocently, though his eyes danced with amusement. "Serving me first. Of course, you are my wife, you deserve the best of everything." "After all these years, I think I have learned that I matter," Eliza said softly. "You do not have to keep proving it." James set down the serving spoon and cupped her face in his calloused hands. "I know you have learned it, but I like proving it anyway." "I will serve you first until the day I die, Eliza Hollister. It is one of the ways I show you that I love you." Eliza leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "I love you too, so much that sometimes it scares me." "Do not be scared, be happy, we have earned our happiness." And she was happy, Eliza realized. Despite everything she had lost, despite all the pain and fear and hunger she had endured, she had found something she never expected. A home, a family, a man who loved her with steady, unwavering devotion. She had learned that she was not too much or too little, not broken or worthless, but simply herself, and that was enough. More than enough. The children grew strong and healthy. Will inherited his father's way with horses and his mother's thoughtful nature. Sarah was wild and fearless, always covered in dirt and full of questions. Thomas was the peacemaker, sweet-tempered and kind. James and Eliza raised them with love and discipline in equal measure, teaching them to be honest, to work hard, and to care for those who had less. In 1888, Chen retired from the boarding house and came to live with them, taking over a small cabin on their property that had been built for a ranch hand. He was getting older, his hands stiff with arthritis, but he still cooked occasionally, teaching Sarah his recipes and telling stories about the old days. Mrs. Hutchins had sold the boarding house and moved to Denver to live with her sister, but she wrote often, always asking after Eliza and the family. James and Eliza grew older together, their love deepening and maturing like wine. They knew each other's rhythms and moods, could communicate with a glance or a touch. They still disagreed sometimes. Eliza thought James was too lenient with Sarah, and James thought Eliza worried too much about Will. But they never went to bed angry, always talking through their differences until they found common ground. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1896, James took Eliza back to the creek where he had first kissed her. It was autumn again, the aspens blazing gold, the air crisp and cool. They walked hand in hand, moving slower than they once had but no less in love. "Do you remember the first time I walked you home?" James asked as they sat on a fallen log beside the water. "I was terrified," Eliza admitted. "I could not understand why you were being kind to me. I kept waiting for you to ask for something in return. And I never did. No, you never did. You just loved me, patiently, persistently, until I had no choice but to believe you." James pulled her close, tucking her against his side. "Best decision I ever made, loving you. Best decision I ever made, letting you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the water flow past, listening to the rustle of the aspens. Eliza thought about the girl she had been when she arrived in Redemption, hollow and haunted, believing she deserved nothing more than scraps and solitude. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone from another life. "Thank you," Eliza said suddenly. "For what? For noticing, for caring, for being the kind of man who saw that I was hungry and decided to do something about it." James kissed the top of her head. "You were always going to be all right, Eliza. You are the strongest person I know. I just helped speed things along." "I do not know if that is true. I think I would have disappeared if you had not seen me, really seen me. Then I am glad I was paying attention." They walked home as the sun set, their long shadows stretching out before them. The house came into view, warm light spilling from the windows, and Eliza could see the shapes of their children moving inside. Sarah was probably pestering her brothers, and Thomas was probably trying to mediate, and Will was probably reading in the corner, oblivious to it all. It was chaotic and noisy and full of life, everything she had never dared to dream of when she was alone and grieving. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, James and Eliza sat together on their porch, wrapped in a quilt against the chill. The stars were brilliant overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding, the birth of their children, the building of their life together. "I have been thinking," Eliza said, her head resting on James's shoulder. "Dangerous pastime," James teased gently. She elbowed him lightly. "I have been thinking that I want to do something to help other women who might be like I was. What did you have in mind?" "I do not know exactly. Maybe working with the church to provide meals for those who need them. Or starting a fund to help women who are alone and struggling, something that would let them know they are not invisible, that someone sees them and cares." James was quiet for a moment, then nodded. I think that is a fine idea, and I will help however I can. You always do, Eliza said softly. Over the following year, Eliza threw herself into her new project. She organized the women of the community to cook meals for families in need. She started a small fund to help widows and single women with expenses. She made it her business to notice those who were struggling, to reach out with the same kind of practical, no-nonsense care that had saved her. She knew firsthand what it meant to be seen and valued, and she wanted to give that gift to others. James supported her fully, just as he had promised. He donated money to the fund, helped distribute food, and used his standing in the community to encourage others to contribute. He was proud of his wife, not just for her compassion, but for the way she had transformed her own pain into purpose. The years continued to pass. Will grew up and married a schoolteacher named Emma, settling on a piece of land adjacent to his parents' homestead. Sarah married a young rancher and moved to Montana, writing long letters full of her adventures. Thomas took over much of the day-to-day running of the ranch, allowing James to slow down a bit as his joints began to protest the hard labor of his youth. In 1905, James and Eliza became grandparents for the first time when Will and Emma welcomed a daughter. Eliza wept with joy when she held the baby, marveling at the tiny fingers and perfect features. James stood beside her, his arm around her waist, and thought about the long, winding road that had brought them to this moment. "We did good," he said quietly. "We did," Eliza agreed, her eyes never leaving her granddaughter's face. As they grew older, James and Eliza settled into a gentler rhythm. They no longer worked from dawn to dusk, instead taking time to sit together, to read, to talk about everything and nothing. James still served Eliza's plate first at every meal, a habit so ingrained that he did it without thinking. And Eliza still felt a surge of love every time he did it, remembering the first time he had made sure she ate hot food while it was fresh. On a warm summer evening in 1910, they sat on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. They were in their 60s now, their hair gray, their faces lined with the years. But when Eliza looked at James, she still saw the young cowboy who had noticed her hunger and decided to do something about it. And when James looked at Eliza, he still saw the beautiful, wounded woman he had fallen in love with, now healed and strong and radiantly happy. "Do you ever regret it?" Eliza asked suddenly. "Tying yourself to me all those years ago," James turned to look at her, surprised. "Not for a single moment. Why would you ask that?" "I do not know. Sometimes I still wonder why you chose me. There were prettier women, easier women, women who did not come with so much baggage." James reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I chose you because you were real. Because underneath all that fear and pain, I saw someone extraordinary. I chose you because when I was with you, I felt like I had come home. And I have never regretted it, not once in 35 years. Eliza squeezed his hand, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I love you, James Hollister. You saved my life." "You saved mine too," James replied. "You just did not know it." They sat together as the stars emerged, surrounded by the life they had built, the family they had created, the love they had nurtured through all the seasons of their lives. And if you had asked Eliza in that moment if she was happy, if she believed she mattered, if she understood her own worth, she would have said yes without hesitation. Because James had taught her, through countless small acts of love and devotion, that she was precious and valuable and deserving of care. And that made all the difference. The seasons turned, bringing 1915, and with it, the quiet contentment of a life well lived. James and Eliza, now in their mid-60s, spent most of their days on the porch of the home they had built together, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Will and Emma had given them 3 grandchildren in total, and Sarah had sent word that she was expecting her 4th. Thomas had married a kind woman named Margaret, and they were expecting their first child. The ranch was thriving under Thomas's management, the cattle healthy and numerous. The homestead had expanded over the years until it was one of the most prosperous in the valley. But what mattered most to James and Eliza was not the material success. It was the love that had grown and multiplied, spreading out like roots from a strong tree. Chen had passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years earlier, and they had buried him on the hill overlooking the creek. Eliza still visited his grave every week, bringing wildflowers and talking to him about the children and the weather and how much she missed his cooking. James often came with her, standing quietly while she spoke, his hand resting on her shoulder. One afternoon in late spring, as they sat watching their grandson chase chickens around the yard, Eliza turned to James with a smile. "Do you remember the first time you served my plate?" James laughed. "How could I forget? Chen thought I was courting you." He was right, of course, but I was not quite ready to admit it yet. "I thought it was the strangest thing," Eliza said, her eyes distant with memory. "No one had ever done something like that for me. I did not know what to make of you. And now I know exactly what to make of you. You are the best man I have ever known, James Hollister, patient and kind and stubborn enough to love me even when I could not love myself." James pulled her close, kissing her temple. "It was never hard loving you, easiest thing I ever did." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon light paint the mountains gold. Their grandson gave up on the chickens and came running over, climbing into Eliza's lap with the fearless affection of a child who had never known anything but love. "Tell me a story, Grandma," he demanded, his dark eyes, so like his grandfather's, bright with expectation. Eliza looked at James and he nodded encouragingly. She settled the boy more comfortably against her chest and began to speak. "Once upon a time, there was a girl who thought she was invisible. She worked hard and gave everything she had to everyone around her, but she never took anything for herself. She was so busy making sure everyone else was happy that she forgot she deserved happiness too." "That is sad," the boy said, frowning. "It was sad," Eliza agreed. But then one day, a cowboy noticed her. He saw that she was always hungry, always waiting until everyone else had eaten before she took a bite, and he decided that was not right. So he started making sure she got her food first while it was still hot and fresh. Was the cowboy nice? The cowboy was very nice, and patient, and clever. He found ways to take care of the girl even when she did not think she deserved to be taken care of. And slowly, day by day, he taught her that she mattered, that she was important, that she deserved love and kindness and all the good things in life. "What happened then?" Eliza smiled, looking over at James, who was watching her with such tenderness it made her heart ache. "The cowboy and the girl fell in love. They got married and built a home together. They had children and grandchildren, and they lived happily ever after." The boy clapped his hands together. "I like that story." "Me too," Eliza said softly. "It is my favorite." Later that evening, after their grandson had been collected by his parents and the house was quiet, James and Eliza prepared supper together. It was a simple meal: roast chicken, potatoes, green beans from the garden. They moved around the kitchen in the synchronized dance of two people who had cooked together for decades, each anticipating the other's movements. When the food was ready, James filled 2 plates, handing Eliza hers first, just as he always had. She took it with a smile, no longer uncomfortable or guilty about being served, simply grateful for this man who had made it his life's work to ensure she never felt less than again. They sat at the table they had shared for nearly 40 years, and James reached across to take Eliza's hand. "Thank you for a beautiful life," he said. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you for giving me one." They ate together as the sun set outside their window, casting long shadows across the land they had tended and loved. And if someone had asked Eliza in that moment what had saved her all those years ago in redemption, she would have said it was not just the food or the kindness or even the love. It was being seen. It was having someone notice her hunger, physical and spiritual and emotional, and decide that she was worth feeding. James had noticed, James had cared, and that had made all the difference. The years that followed were gentle ones. James and Eliza grew older with grace, their love for each other deepening into something that transcended words. They had become a legend of sorts in the community. The cowboy who had courted his wife by making sure she ate first, and the woman who had learned to accept love after a lifetime of deprivation. When James died peacefully in his sleep in 1920 at the age of 70, Eliza grieved deeply, but without despair. She knew she had been blessed with a love that most people only dreamed of, a partnership that had transformed both of them into better versions of themselves. She wore his wedding ring on a chain around her neck, next to her own, and continued to live in the home they had built, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. On quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch and remember. She would remember the girl she had been, hollow-eyed and hungry, believing she deserved nothing. She would remember the first time James had served her plate, the confusion and wonder she had felt. She would remember the way he had loved her, patiently and persistently, until she had no choice but to believe she was worthy of that love. And she would smile because she knew the truth. Love had saved her. Not just any love, but the specific, particular love of a cowboy who had noticed she never ate until others finished, and had decided to serve her plate first. That simple act of care had been the beginning of everything, of healing, of hope, of a life filled with more joy than she had ever imagined possible. When Eliza passed away in her sleep in 1925, surrounded by family, she died with a smile on her face. They buried her next to James on the hill overlooking the creek, and at her request, they included a simple inscription on her headstone. She was seen, she was loved, she was enough. The homestead continued through the generations, passed down from parent to child, each one hearing the story of their great-grandparents and the love that had built their family. And always in that family, there was a tradition. At every meal, wives and mothers were served first, their plates filled with care and attention, a living reminder of the cowboy who had noticed one woman's hunger and had decided to do something about it. Because in the end, that was what love looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but the daily, consistent choice to see someone, to value them, to ensure they knew they mattered. James had understood that instinctively, and he had lived it out in every small act of service and devotion. And Eliza, the girl who had once believed she was invisible, had learned to let herself be seen. She had learned that her needs were valid, her hunger real, her worth inherent. She had learned that she did not have to earn love through endless giving and self-denial, but could simply receive it as the gift it was. That was the legacy they left behind, not just land or cattle or material wealth, but the knowledge that everyone deserves to be fed, to be noticed, to be cared for. That no one should have to wait for scraps when they could be given a full plate. That love, real love, sees hunger and seeks to satisfy it, not because the hungry person has earned it, but simply because they exist, and that is enough. The story of James and Eliza Hollister became a cherished part of family lore, told and retold to each new generation. It was a story about the Old West, about survival and hardship and the forging of new lives in an untamed land. But more than that, it was a story about the transformative power of being truly seen, about the way one person's consistent kindness can heal wounds that seemed unhealable. On summer evenings, when the family gathered for reunions at the old homestead, they would sit on the porch that James had built and look out over the land he had tended. They would pass around platters of food, and always the women would be served first, their plates filled high. It was a ritual that honored their ancestors, a tangible reminder of a love that had started with the simple act of noticing someone's hunger. And if you listened carefully on those quiet evenings, you might almost hear the echo of James's voice, steady and sure, saying what he had said so many times to the woman he loved. "Eat, sweetheart. You deserve the best of everything." Because she did. Because everyone does. And sometimes it takes a cowboy with a kind heart and observant eyes to make us believe it.